I'm Simran. It's so nice to see you all here. I really appreciate it. And we're doing this event in conjunction with the Institute of Current World Affairs. So thank you so much to Greg Pfeiffer and Bruce Teeter for setting this up. We really appreciate it. And I hope you enjoy the event, and I will be welcoming Greg to introduce the panel. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Simran. I'm Gregory Pfeiffer. As Simran said, I'm the Executive Director of the Institute of Current World Affairs, or ICWA as we call it. And it's absolutely a delight to be here. It's Veterans Day, it's raining outside, and I'm just so pleased to see all of you. Thank you for coming. I'm also very grateful to the Elliott School for hosting us in this terrific space, and especially the Delta Phi Epsilon fraternity for organizing this talk on a very, very important subject. Because since the start of the Syrian civil war in 2011 prompted the world's largest refugee crisis, more than 14 million people have been forced to flee Syria. It's a staggering number if you think about it. A dozen years on, what is the state of Syria's diaspora? Some 5.5 million people live in neighboring countries, Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, Iraq, and Egypt. And life was already precarious for Syrian exiles before February's earthquakes in Turkey and Syria. And now, with calls mounting to expel Syrian migrants from host countries, what are the prospects for Syrians abroad in the future? ICWA fellow Joshua Levkowitz spent 2 years immersing himself in Syrian refugee communities. Based in Istanbul, he traveled across Turkey and widely to many other countries, including Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, Armenia, and Germany. At a time that some of those countries are normalizing relations with the regime of Syrian President Bashar al-Assad, and blaming Syrian migrants for their own local problems, and forcing unwilling Syrians back to Syria, with Syria's war still a major conflict. Joshua has reported on the plight of Syrian migrants and the issues of assimilation, identity, and security, networks between Syrians abroad and people back at home, and the impact the diaspora is having on their host countries. Before we hear his conclusions, however, I would just like to say a few words about the Institute of Current World Affairs. We send outstanding young professionals abroad for 2 years, virtually any country around the world, studying virtually any topic. And in these 2 years of deep cultural immersion, they acquire deep understanding of their societies, and they become leading experts on international cultures and affairs. One of our former fellows is our moderator today, Andrew Tabler. He was an ICWA fellow starting in 2005 in Lebanon, in Syria, and Egypt. And he gained unparalleled access to Syria during his fellowship. And he went on to become a senior fellow at the Washington Institute for Near East Policy. And along the way, he served as senior advisor to the Special Envoy for Syria Engagement at the U.S. Department of State's Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs, and director for Syria at the National Security Council's Middle East Affairs Directorate. So today's panel is in excellent hands, and it's a very distinguished panel indeed. I will introduce the panelists after we hear from Joshua. He will speak about his on-the-ground experiences, and then after the ensuing discussion, we'll have a Q&A with you, the audience. And I ask that when you ask questions, please state your name and stick to one question. And with that, I welcome Joshua.
Hello. Good morning, everyone. My name is Joshua Levkowitz. Firstly, I want to thank ICWA for accepting my initial idea and for Greg and for Bruce for working through my research over the last 2 years. The title of my project was Syrians in Exile. I initially applied to pursue big picture fieldwork on the situation of the Syrian diaspora. I spent time with Syrians across Turkey, Egypt, Jordan, Lebanon, Iraq, Qatar, Kuwait, Armenia, and Germany. In one of my first articles about remittances, an older Syrian man told me a joke. The story goes like this. Presidents Reagan, Gorbachev, and Hafez al-Assad, father of the current Syrian president, meet at a summit in the 1980s. To break the ice, they start discussing their salaries. Reagan says, "I make $400,000 a year." Gorbachev, in response, puffs out his chest, "Ha, well, I earn $500,000 a year." Assad, off to the side, seemingly uninterested, responds, "I only make a few $100s a year." Puzzled, Reagan and Gorbachev ask, "How do you get by on such a salary?" With a smirk, he responds, "Oh, my children send me money every month from abroad." There's truth behind every joke. Family and migration have always been important support networks for Syrians who rely on one another, and this relationship has only grown as the conflict continues. But more seriously, the war in Syria, now in its 13th year, remains one of the major crises today. It has led to the death of nearly 500,000 people, displaced half of its pre-war population, and led to the largest exodus in our time. The protracted conflict has also influenced the discourse around migrant rights, political polarization that we're seeing playing out today, from South America to South Asia, and everywhere in between. But upon reflection from my fieldwork, the larger issues that I applied to research stand out much less than the time I spent hearing very personal stories from Syrians transitioning to refugee or resident. In Turkey, I met with journalists and merchants, hustlers benefiting from mass displacement, young men trying to dodge mass military conscription, Syrians trying to integrate into an area that not so long ago was considered their own, Syrian seasonal workers keeping afloat the country's agriculture sector while simultaneously being scapegoated for taking jobs. In Jordan, I met students aiming to go to university despite the barriers stacked against them. And in Lebanon, I watched as Syrians refused to leave their homes, as a series of military raids and coordinated political campaigns sought to kick them out of the country. I spent time in older diaspora communities that have been established before the outbreak of war, including Syrian professionals who moved in the 20th century to the Arab Gulf region in search of economic prosperity. I also engaged with more recent social circles where the narrative, boundaries, and sense of place of these newcomers has yet to emerge. Demography was also present in my research. Throughout the Syrian conflict, the United Nations has rightfully tried to prioritize at-risk groups, namely women and youth, for protection and assistance. However, I met with elders who said that they missed the dangers faced by aging refugees, simultaneously reeling from conflict, language barriers, ageism, and chronic health conditions. Even in conversations with some of the most privileged of these Syrian elders, it is clear they face isolation, exclusion, and a deeply fractured sense of self. In their eyes, an entire life in Syria vanished overnight, with not enough time, now too late in life, to build a new one elsewhere. Retirees also weren't immune to the rising wave of xenophobia we've seen play out. I remember one Syrian elder recounting being accosted by a Turkish woman while sitting outside at a cafe enjoying her afternoon coffee. She screamed at me, "You are Syrian. How can you sit here and have a coffee while we suffer?" The lady recounted. One imagines that to the harasser, this woman, her cup of coffee, did not fit the archetype of Syrians fleeing war. In the absence of education and understanding of the manifold reasons for migration, misinformation and prejudice all too quickly can fill the void. I also spent time with minority groups within the larger diaspora, a reflection that social dynamics continue to play out even after crossing borders. I met with LGBTQ+ Syrians searching to be safe and to be seen in the Berlin queer scene, those who were seen in Syria as Armenians, but now in Armenia as Syrians, and Syrian Jews who were not seen at all in their own country and also not seen at all in their new one. Throughout my fellowship, several truths have played out. There's a tendency that we view integration as an either-or phenomenon, but all of these people have faced challenges in their transition, navigating new languages, new lands, new limitations. For the majority, they remain stuck in a kind of extended limbo, unwanted by the country they're in, unable to move on, and unable or unwilling to go back. And in the final 6 months of my fellowship, I spent time on the Turkish-Syrian border, focused on more recent loss and tragedy for a people that have faced more than enough. I visited southern Turkey a few weeks before the February 6th earthquake struck, and immediately after, where the majority of Syrian refugees in Turkey live. I observed how a government responds to a historical crisis and to whom they give priority. I also observed how tragedy can push a local population further towards nativism. This renewed displacement led to double forms of discrimination, which then bled into Turkey's nasty presidential and parliamentary elections, where Syrians were put front and center, being blamed for the country's economic collapse, change in demographic character, and preemptively being held liable just in case there's any potential election fraud. Syrian women in the earthquake zone faced additional risks that hindered them from seeking assistance or accessing facilities. Even if the earthquake was natural, the response was very political. Gender-blind development policies will continue to leave them and other segments of society behind. In many ways, this morass has only gotten muddier since I started my research. New deals are being made with autocrats, warlords, strongmen to keep Syrians and other migrants away from European and American shores. Frontex, which aims to securitize the border, is the fastest growing agency in the EU. As long as Syrians are not heading to Europe in large numbers as they did back in 2014, there's a lack of interest in what is happening to them, as long as they're kept at a distance. It took a subsequent historic tragedy to force the world to stop ignoring Syrians, even if provisionally. After the earthquake, the United States temporarily eased sanctions to accelerate humanitarian aid in northwestern Syria. Berlin allowed Turkish and Syrian residents to bring their loved ones who had been displaced from the earthquake areas. But still here in the US, the administration is largely pursuing a policy of passive neglect. In countries hosting large numbers of Syrians today, rising hostilities, organized campaigns are calling for them to be returned back. This is happening in the failed state of Lebanon to the very stable Denmark. The UN has slashed assistance to refugees in Jordan and Lebanon, citing funding shortfalls. Syria today now very much exists beyond its borders, but let us briefly take a look inside the country. As we can see playing out in many conflicts, if you wait long enough, hearsay eventually sounds like gospel. The growing calls to bring Syrian President Bashar al-Assad back into the fold has shocked Syrians, stupefied analysts, and silenced governments. I will let my co-panelists focus more on the situation inside Syria, but I just want to point out that the protracted conflict that is playing out with displaced Syrians is very much a result of an ongoing failure to find a political settlement inside Syria. This stasis also contributes to the dire economic situation playing out in the country, pushing young people to want to leave, to find their futures elsewhere. This buries any hope of the country turning a corner anytime soon. Despite this, more attention, and not less, is required from the halls of power here and elsewhere if we hope to change that. If not, conflict will beget conflict and only lead to more displacement and despair. Today, over 60% of Syrians are displaced from their homes. In Turkey, where the largest number of them live, several policy changes can provide immediate relief to host society and refugee community alike. Just as the US has recently afforded new rights for certain migrants on the eligibility to work, more can be done to help Syrians inside Turkey today. For example, if Syrians are given a more structured pathway to formal employment, they can contribute more to Turkey's economy. Employment is recognized as a driver of integration. As of now, employers must bear the cost of hiring Syrians, and they're often reluctant to do so. This gives birth to predatory practices that keep Syrians off the books, undercuts wages for everyone, but the opposite can protect Syrians, and it can assuage working-class Turks' concerns about Syrians stealing jobs or evading taxes. Secondly, Syrians under temporary protection are currently restricted from leaving the province they're registered in. But this ought to be changed, because if they have the ability to move around the country, they can better match their personal preferences and employment opportunities. Thirdly, after years of limbo under temporary protection, Syrians should be finally allowed to apply for medium to long-term residency in Turkey to encourage their integration. A similar policy has recently been adopted in Colombia regarding displaced Venezuelans there. This process should start with Syrian children born in Turkey who are de facto stateless. And while I think these policies are measured, reasonable, and can reduce tensions, it's important to note that people are people. They do not need to first serve a utilitarian purpose for host societies to provide them with these necessary protections. These days, stories can be more persuasive than statistics. Facts are effective if they form part of a larger narrative. So I wanted to end my speech speaking about one family. I became close with Mohammed and his children. Like millions of others, they have been zigzagging between and within countries to try to build a sense of stability for much of the last decade. I met them originally in Antakya in southern Turkey, and I saw them again on a subsequent trip. We grew close, and I learned that one of their eldest sons had been killed back in Syria by ISIS. And then during the February 6th earthquakes, they had been thrashed from side to side before their entire building split into two. And unfortunately, their second son had died buried in the rubble. He had been a 17-year-old volunteer with the Red Cross. They recovered his body, and then they moved on, refused shelter in the Mediterranean city of Mersin. Until their money ran out, they then moved on to a nearby train station, and then to a temporary shelter erected by a family member in a neighboring city. Eventually, though, they made it to Istanbul, where they stayed for the last 7 months. I met them several times in their basement apartment. I've seen them deal with a lot. They had coped with the loss of their sons, panicked over a doomsday prediction of another earthquake to hit Istanbul. They witnessed war, political and economic collapse, a once-in-a-lifetime natural disaster, and subsequent political and economic crises in Turkey, including election hysteria and its fallout in terms of a crackdown against migrants. But when I visited them in October, their apartment smelled of ammonia. The entire family had dyed their hair blonde. We want to look more French, they told me. After years of radio silence, the French government had finally invited them for an in-person interview to determine if they could be resettled there. And in some good news, last month, Mohammed told me that they would be accepted and were moving in December. I went to meet them before coming here, and his two little daughters dangled their feet off their chairs and repeated each time a French woman said, "C'est bon," over and over on a YouTube language channel. "C'est bon," Mohammed told me, laughing, smiling over the fact that his daughters can finally stop running. "C'est bon," we all said together. France will certainly offer a new set of challenges, but after living through enough suffering for several lifetimes, something good had happened for this one family. But there are more than 5 million others still in Turkey and neighboring countries, and even more displaced inside Syria. Their happy endings have yet to come. The Syrian context and its diaspora today are not being helped by the increasing polarization of societies worldwide. And while all of you, I'm sure, are sympathetic to the situation of Syrians, their case is a testament to a larger dynamic. Our world is more mobile than it's ever been, and these trends are only on the rise. The experience of the Syrian diaspora has lessons and can be applied to other contexts, including here in the United States. So in conclusion, I want to thank ICWA for the opportunity to study displacement and war, and for all of you for listening to me this morning. I will continue to work on these topics, and I believe I'm better off for it. Thank you.
Joshua was very well qualified for his fellowship. He had, before becoming a fellow, lived in Iraq and Erbil, working for the U.S. Institute of Peace in conflict mediation. But there were questions at the Institute about, well, does studying the Syrian diaspora across many countries constitute studying a society? And I'm happy to say, for ICWA's sake, yes, it does. And Joshua has just done a remarkable job, not only traveling widely, but becoming embedded in places and among families with whom he still keeps up. And it's just been an incredible job. So thank you very much, Joshua. Now I would like to introduce our very distinguished panelists. Basma Alouche is the External Relations Officer at the UN High Commission for Refugees. She's also a lecturer here at George Washington University's Elliott School. She was previously policy advisor at the International Committee of the Red Cross, leading the policy team's work on the Middle East, Afghanistan, and restrictive measures. And she was senior policy and advocacy advisor at the Norwegian Refugee Council USA. And joining us on Zoom from Spain is Rafif Jouadjati, the co-founder and director of the Foundation to Restore Equality and Education in Syria, or Free Syria, and the principal architect of the Syrian Freedom Charter project, which surveyed more than 50,000 Syrians on democratic aspirations and political transition. Rafif also served as spokesperson and executive committee member of the local coordination committees in Syria, and as a spokesperson for the National Coalition for Syrian Revolution and Opposition Forces during the Geneva II peace process. She is also a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. And I've also, I've already mentioned some of Andrew Tabler's many accomplishments. I'll only add that he is the author of the book In the Lion's Den, an eyewitness account of Washington's battle with Syria, and he's one of the most sought after commentators on Syria in this country. With that, I hand off to you, Andrew.
Great. Well, first of all, thanks so much for taking the time to come out here today. To discuss a sad topic, but at the same time, maybe from a hopeful direction. And I think the direction and the focus of Joshua's fellowship has been unusual in that it went over the course of, has gone over many countries, tracking the diaspora population that has come out of Syria as a result of the war. I recently gave a presentation here in Washington, at least someone in the audience was there, and I said that probably one of the few good things that's come out of the Syrian war is that we have now so many sources, so many really direct primary sources to tell us about Syria and about what people suffered there. And on the sad side, it's because they were forced to leave as a result of the war, but on a positive side, they're here with us now in the West and beyond. And that was not always the case. In the past, you had to go to someone that had access to Syria in order to get some information about it. And most Syrians were afraid to talk about how they really felt, certainly about Bashar al-Assad and Hafiz al-Assad, his father, but about the whole system there. And so, oh, sorry, I didn't turn on my microphone. And so, we have a completely different situation. Oh, wow. Okay. And now we're able to actually track things in detail. The Syrian war was the first war to unfold in real time on YouTube video. And I think those images and the experience that we hear directly from Syrians puts the conflict front and center in front of all of us in the West, particularly in the United States, but not only. And it also puts us in a dilemma, because in the past, we were able to shrug our shoulders and say, well, we don't really understand things there, perhaps it's not so bad, what can we really do? And the fact is, that the experience of the Syrian war, the chemical weapons use, and other things which have caused Syrians to flee, all of those things, the supposed red lines that they caused leaders to put down, in the case here it was Barack Obama when he was president, ended up not being red lines at all, and called into question all over the world American credibility. And I think that in and of itself wasn't just a concern in the Middle East, which is understandable. The United States has many alliances there, but also just in terms of our ability to affect the world in the Far East and beyond. I was in Japan the day that President Obama gave his famous interview to Jeffrey Goldberg in The Atlantic, calling what's known in the US government as the non-strike incident of September 2013 as his moment of liberation. But for the Japanese, for the Koreans, certainly for the Ukrainians and beyond perhaps, it was anything but. It was a shameful moment for this country. And I'm not saying that from a political standpoint. I'm saying that as an American, as somebody that's looked at this conflict. But enough of me talking. I'd like to actually, I'm so happy to be able to sit up here with you today on Armistice Day, or Veterans Day as it's known now. And we have two great Syrians here on the panel who can tell us a little bit about, and I'd like to ask you to both talk about your impressions of Joshua's statements, but also about your own views of some of the subject matter as members of the diaspora, but also observance of the diaspora and its dynamics. So, Basma, would you like to go first since you're here in front of us, and then we go to Rafif? Is that fair enough? Okay, Basma, over to you.
Thanks, Andrew, and thank you all for having me. It's great that we can still talk about Syria and that Syria is still getting some attention despite everything else happening in the world. And it's also great to see Rafif, a friend I haven't seen in a really long time. I think first and foremost, just kind of following some of Joshua's work and reading some of his pieces, I have to say, if you haven't checked them out, please do, because he humanizes Syrians in ways that many people don't. You know, oftentimes we hear about these in crazy numbers, these millions of refugees, millions of people internally displaced, but we often don't hear about the individual stories and how people are not only impacted, we hear of the destruction, we hear of the damage and the fact, you know, all these factors forcing people to flee, but it's really rare that we get deep insight into what people are actually experiencing and how they're coping with the experience. And I think Joshua did a really great job outlining that in some of his work, you know, interviewing Syrians across the world. So highly encouraging you to check those out. And it really resonated with me because it's something that I often grapple with, you know, with my work, being Syrian, working on Syria, trying to talk about Syria, but really making sure that we're constantly grounded and reminded with the fact that these are human beings that we're dealing with. So that definitely really strongly resonated with me. I think the issue today that was alluded to by Joshua is the fact that we still have millions of people outside of Syria. And the more we continue to engage with this issue as a temporary issue, the more we're going to fail these people and the more we're going to neglect and overlook some of their ongoing needs. And this short-term thinking in addressing conflicts, byproducts of conflicts, you know, the consequences and the displacement being a symptom, but also a massive issue to grapple with. You know, continuing to look at it in such a short-term lens is really not serving the people, but it's also not serving us well. Having to just, you know, program and look at, you know, funding cycles that are just annual, that doesn't help build people's resilience. It doesn't help integrate people, provide durable solutions, provide sustainable ways to end their displacement and help them rebuild their lives. And now we're talking about a conflict that has lasted for 12 years. Many of the children left Syria. Roots are shifting because so many of these kids don't know Syria but are now entering, you know, adolescence and are teenagers and are adjusting, you know, some Syrian children that I know, you know, speak broken Arabic because they've adapted to, you know, either speaking Turkish or German or other languages. So these are some of the issues that I wanted to kind of put forward for us to think about. Maybe I'll stop here and
Great.
pick it up later.
Thank you very much. Rafif, over to you.
Hi, thank you, everybody. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you for including me in this event, and it's great to see you too, Basma and Andrew. Joshua, hats off to you. I can only say, c'est bon, as a measure of Syrian resiliency in what has been such a heartbreaking experience for millions of Syrians, but job well done. I want to echo what Basma said about reading Joshua's work, because very often academic papers fail to address the human aspect. And Joshua, you did that so brilliantly, so thank you for that really impressive body of work. I am not an expert in refugees, so I'll leave that to Basma. But in my capacity with Free Syria, with the LCC, and then with large civil society organizations like Beitna, or the Day After, or now a political organization, the Syrian Liberal Party, I come into contact with Syrians every day. Some are inside, some are in the diaspora. And for many of us, overwhelmingly, the conversation is certainly about the challenges affecting refugees today, but the bigger conversation among many of us is that anything to do with refugee status is a short-term question. And to get to the heart of the problem, you have to address the root cause, which is the Assad regime. So I approach things from that perspective. With some of the greatest numbers of displaced people in the world inside Syria, we have to ask ourselves, why are they displaced? Why do we have refugees abroad? And how can we change the situation so that people can go back home safely? And I'll leave it at that, and I'm happy to engage in further discussion. Thank you.
Great. Okay, so let me just start out with a question to Joshua, and then we'll kind of open it up a little bit here, maybe get from the specifics of your fellowship into a little bit of policy and questions. So when I lived in Syria about 7 years, on and off, and it was a different place. It was what we called stable in the old days. There was a policy of stability concerning Syria. I started there in 2001, and I left at the end of 2008. Most Syrians were pretty cool customers. They were pretty shrewd people, very friendly, hospitable, but they usually didn't tell you what was on their mind until they got to know you a little bit better. In fact, sometimes if you were dining with someone and they said the name Assad, they would crouch down and then look over their shoulder. I'm not kidding. It really was something like right out of East Germany or like Eastern Bloc. But you approached your fellowship in a different time and across many different countries. How was it going out as an American to meet all these different folks who have been displaced from different parts of the country and different reasons? Was it easy? Was it hard? How did you, as we say in ICWA, follow your nose and get into the story that you've told very well?
Thank you. Yeah, I mean, sometimes it works beautifully. I mean, the Syrian community is a very welcoming community, like many communities around the world. It's not uniquely a Syrian phenomenon, but Syrians are quite open. And I think sometimes it takes time. Sometimes it took many visits for people to start to open up. And other times people just wanted to chat. You know, they wanted someone who maybe wasn't a family member, or maybe wasn't, someone who was a journalist or someone who had some kind of aid approach. So I don't know, I think kind of the beautiful thing about ICWA is it's this amorphous, it can be anything, and I think part of that also helps people maybe open up, because it really, I didn't need to get them to go in a certain direction. Like it was very much was very nice for ICWA as opposed to writing for, hard media, for example, where if the conversation doesn't go a certain way, but that's okay. Like, we can just have the conversation that people want to have. And I think that really can work very well. So that's one important thing. Secondly, networks are incredible. There have been periods where I'll get on a plane with no one at the moment to speak with, and then when I land, you have 15 different people who have said, like, oh, so-and-so told me that you've landed in Doha, and it's great. So sometimes, there's a lot of consternation of, like, this is not gonna go well, and then you get there and you're like, okay, I'm busy, I'm not gonna have dinner tonight because it's just back-to-back meetings. And, once you spend time with people and you enjoy their company, it becomes fun. So it's really, really nice. So yeah, so I think just not really having to have an agenda and then just kind of being there to listen to people, I think both were quite effective ways to kind of move the fellowship along over the 2 years.
And did you find that a majority of what was put across the table to you in the various interviews and so on, how much of it was about solving the overall crisis or the overall conflict, and how much of it was just about getting by and surviving? Was there a way, did it matter if they were in a neighboring country like Lebanon or Turkey, and did it get better or worse the further they got out from it if they were in Germany or elsewhere? Or how did that stack up, the high politics that people in policy focus on all the time with the day-to-day stuff and the refugee aspects of things, which Basma and Rafif are probably more familiar with?
Yeah, it is very interesting. So, on one hand, we can look at it that maybe the further removed you are from Syria, the more safety you feel, and also maybe the more distance you have that you can be maybe a bit more strong. So, for example, in Berlin, there's an extremely active political scene there. And as I said, I was, for example, there writing about the Syrian queer community there. So, of course, that is something that maybe wouldn't manifest itself in another context, even though it does exist, so it's not unique to Berlin. But it also depends on individuals. I spent a lot of time with, one article I wrote, I'm from the South, it was cold in Istanbul, I went down to the Florida of Turkey and hung out with a bunch of elderly Syrians, and they just wanted to chat. Like, they wanted to tell me about starting calligraphy classes or, meeting people. One thing that was interesting was that inside Syria, due to the politics of the last half century, there's a lot of isolation, geographic isolation, class isolation, ethno-religious isolation. And actually in the diaspora, people told me that they were able to meet people from other parts of the country that they didn't really ever spend much time with. So hanging out with someone from Tartus and someone from Aleppo in Mersin was quite liberating to them as well, because maybe they wouldn't have had that opportunity. Not saying that is warranted in any way, but that was able to open it up. Whereas other times I was literally on the Syrian border in Turkey, and there was the person was speaking past me and hoping that I was getting a message to someone that never got that message. So yeah, so it really just depended on everyone's either agenda or lack of agenda.
Joshua was getting into something about here, the experience of being dispersed in so many different ways as refugees or even fleeing in advance of these things, or even internally inside of the country. How has this affected Syrian identity in terms of both political but otherwise? Joshua sort of gone into the fact that in a way it's brought Syrians in some senses closer to each other.
It's not often I have the time to sit and think about that, or sit and think about these issues. But it reminds me, so the Arab Reform Initiative, a think tank based in Paris, conducted a study once, this was back in, 2016, 2017, where they mapped out Syrian diaspora around the world and basically looked at the way that they were organized and that the way that they engaged. So I was in charge of researching Syrian American diaspora. And to my surprise, it was such a clear shift, seeing the protests coming out in 2011, the uprising, the Arab Spring wave, this wave of, hopefulness and people excited and, hoping that things could improve in the region. I think that really shattered some of the kind of barriers that people had self-imposed because of the dynamics in the country. And so you see that really translating to existing diaspora outside of Syria as well. So you had Syrians inside Syria kind of developing a voice, developing, their political awareness, and really calling and asking for their own, liberation and freedom and rights and all of that type of stuff. But then you see that mirrored in the diaspora where, I spoke to some members of the Syrian American community that had really, and Rafif probably knows more about this because I didn't grow up in the US, but they were almost siloed. There were pockets of Syrians in Ohio and Florida and other areas, but it was very, you talk to your neighbors, your friends, but Syrians among each other, as far as I understood, didn't really try to reach out and build those connections and build those bridges. But after the Arab Spring, you saw that change as well. And so now you're seeing the Syrian American diaspora that's super mobilized, super organized, is very kind of politically aware, but also just wants to now, be part of policy conversations, engaging in Washington, forming these different organizations. Rafif again can talk more about that, forming these political organizations, but it was a really fascinating shift, and I think that is a small mirror of what you're seeing, happen to Syrians globally, where now people no longer want to sit back and be silent. It almost maybe has also sometimes created a generational change where you have the younger Syrians pushing back, where their parents still kind of hold some of the reservations, some of that, internalized fear of speaking out. I mean, I see it in my own family where, when I say things to my mom, she's like, what are you talking, why are you saying this out loud? And so it's really, I think it's such a fascinating shift, and I think that has really developed and changed Syrian identity and the way Syrians viewed themselves. I mean, I came to the US in 2007, didn't really know any Syrians. 2011, I just wanted to be around Syrians. So that's just my personal experience. I'm sure that's happened to many, many others.
Sure. Rafif, how do you see it?
Thanks. A couple of things. I think in some refugee communities, especially if they fled because of political activity, and by political activity, I mean they went to a demonstration and now they're being targeted by the regime, right? People who had to flee don't have that much to lose anymore, and so they're happy to talk. If they participated in any sort of civil resistance or civil disobedience, then for the most part, they've scaled the wall of fear and they are happy to tell their story. In fact, they're eager to have their voices heard. And this is translated in the United States, in Europe, in Turkey, where people once displaced, once living in a foreign country, for example, in Europe, and you mentioned Berlin, where there is a very large civil society presence among Syrians, you see all kinds of collaboration between Sunnis and Alawis, between Christians and others. I'm just saying that we have come together as Syrians, and that is our identity, as opposed to any type of religious or ethnic or sectarian background. In a sense, everybody has a common fate once they're abroad. It's probably a little bit easier in Europe because, at least until a few weeks ago, there was a better sense of freedom. There was a sense of distance from old traditions. And Basma, I think you're absolutely right with there being a bit of a generational gap, because the older generation is still too familiar with fear, whereas the youth, for those who left as small children or even as teenagers, they remember the liberation of being able to stand up and say, "Ash-sha'ab yurid isqat al-nizam," or the people want the collapse of the regime. And so they are eager to push back on tradition and become more active politically.
Okay, great, thank you. I could talk about this subject all day because my last job in government was I was the point person for dealing with the Syrian opposition, which is incredibly hopeful in the identity sense, but incredibly frustrating in the political sense. But we won't get into that today. At another time, perhaps over some food or something else. But let's go to the audience for questions. You had a chance to listen to everything we've had to say. Greg, do you want to take the director's priority and ask the first question?
Thank you, Andrew. I was hoping you were going to say that. Do we have a microphone?
Oh, okay.
And this is terrific. First of all, thank you so much for just an excellent discussion full of insight about a topic that is very abstract for most Americans. We Americans sort of like to believe in progress, or some of us do, but we like good stories and happy endings. So forgive this possibly naive question. But Joshua, in summing up his talk and hitting on some policy recommendations, concentrated on what host countries can and should be doing. Basma spoke about changed identity among Syrians. You all did. Rafif said the root issue is inside Syria, the Assad regime. But he's coming back on the world stage. He's still backed by Russia, which has enabled his survival. Among the Syrian community, broadly dispersed and varied as it is there any hope of return? Are people thinking about return? Are there any signs for optimism? I frankly don't see them, but I'm a completely outside observer. Thank you.
Who'd like to go first?
I can go. So, really important question. So again, 12 years into the conflict, right? And we're looking at millions of refugees in neighboring countries and others. And in the humanitarian world, we often look at returns, integration, and resettlement as like the jargon is durable solutions, right? Sustainable way to end displacement. So UNHCR's position right now is Syria is not safe for return. We conduct an intentions survey where we survey, a few thousand refugees in neighboring countries, in Turkey, Lebanon, Jordan, and Egypt. And in 2023, the intentions survey came back with 1% of the Syrian refugees that we surveyed said that they were interested or hopeful to return to Syria in the next 12 months. To be accurate, it was 1.1%. We also ask, about hopes to return to Syria one day. We got 56%. So one day, could be 5 years, could be more. That is a decrease from over 70%, which is what we received last year. So you see in 1 year, almost 20% of Syrians said that, 20% less of Syrian refugees are hopeful of returning to Syria one day. So I think with these intentions and with, these are refugees voicing their own concerns, they're still citing safety and security as a primary concern, forced conscription, all of these issues that are really barriers to them even thinking of returning. But you're also seeing the economic situation, lack of job opportunities, lack of access to basic services, healthcare, etc., being major impediments for them, to return to Syria. Keeping in mind, many Syrians left not because of political opposition, but because they were fleeing conflict. So if they knew that they had access, to safe housing, to, basic services, that could shift their calculation. But the fact that those don't exist in Syria right now is an impediment for these people to return. So I think if we're going to look at returns, it has to be, or look at the status of Syrian refugees, it has to be this comprehensive situation where, again, many are stuck where they are. They're in limbo. They're living in host communities where there's increasing tensions, but there's also decreasing access to resources, economic crises in Lebanon. I mean, Lebanon is dealing with so much right now. The Lebanese society is really going through a lot, and so having refugees, in these environments is definitely not sustainable. And you're seeing this increased sentiment amongst host communities that are feeling abandoned by the international community because international attention is constantly shifting and diverting. I mean, the US, for example, has been one of the biggest donors in the humanitarian response to Syria and neighboring countries. That we're seeing those numbers decreasing. We're seeing, a lot of decreased attention, decreased funding and resources that all end up making living conditions for refugees that much harder. So now we're seeing them stuck in areas where there's no hope for a future. There's no legal pathways for them to seek an end to their displacement, but at the same time, returns is just not something that they're, thinking about right now.
Great. Rafik, do you have something to add?
Not much. I know we're past time. But it's interesting. Just some 10 years ago, I was in Zaatari camp, and I surveyed some of the youth who were there, and about 75% of them wanted to go back and rebuild Syria. And Basma, I'm not surprised that at this point it's about 1%. But I will say, for families that have integrated, there's no going back. They have children who were born in the host countries. They are now maybe becoming citizens. They are fluent in the host country language. There's no going back. But in many of the circles I run in, there is always the hope. And when we used to say the regime was on its last legs and it'll be crushed in 6 months or a year, now we're saying a regime that took 60 years to build is going to take a long time to dismantle. I believe there's always hope for a better future inside Syria. And part of that hope is spurred by images of peaceful protests in Sweda, also in Idlib. We're seeing some murmurs in the Alawi community that are gonna turn into shouts pretty soon. I think there's always hope. I have to believe that. So I'm gonna go with yes, there's hope. Thank you.
All right, hope it is. Another question, please. Sir.
Hi, my name is Yu Tong. I am an undergraduate student studying the Middle East. Oh, okay. Thank you for delivering a very well-presented information about Syrian in exile. And my question is, in recent months, there's certainly, even in recent years, there's this rise of far-right across the globe. In Germany, US, France, China, there are a lot of far-right, traditional conservative policy being mentioned, and I remember, Rafi, you currently live in Spain, and Speaker Joshua mentioned about France, and I wonder, with the election coming up in EU Parliament, also Germany and the US, and there's this, what are your thoughts on the effect of Syrian in relation to the far-right politics around the globe?
Interesting question. Joshua, you want to take a step?
Sure. So this is not my field of study, but I think the effect is done now. You have the far right, these far right parties that are playing out in Europe. I mean, they're kind of currently being blocked from entering any type of coalition, but it's interesting that you have someone like Merkel, who is from a center-right party traditionally, and she was very much pro-migration. And now the current leader in Germany is the opposite, is more onto the liberal side. But is now coming out. I saw that he had an interview in Das Spiegel about, this needs to end and we need to create these borders. I think 10 or 11 European countries have created walls that they're erecting. As I mentioned in the speech, that Frontex is kind of on the rise. So it's scary what's happening, but I also just think that even outside of government, they're having very much an effect on kind of this shift to a more nativist, a kind of a nativist approach that's happening in Europe and elsewhere as well.
Yeah. Okay. Ma'am, did you have a question? Or, sorry, I thought I saw your hand up. Just, sure, please. And then Catherine, sorry.
Peter Leon, I'm a new ICWIT trustee. Oh, this is Paul. Thanks. Peter Leon, I'm a new ICWIT trustee, a lawyer based in London. Really very interesting discussion. I do have two questions, one for Josh here on integration. Where did you find in your work, in your research, had communities integrated best? Obviously you talked about Turkey, but I'd be interested to know about other countries such as Germany. And then to the panel, really on Rafif's point, is there any chance whatsoever that this dreadful regime could possibly come to an end? And if so, how?
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, so one place, for example, in southern Turkey, in a place called Antakya, that historically was part of Greater Syria, where the community did speak a dialect of Arabic very similar to border areas in northwestern Syria. There were, these communities had a lot of contacts, a lot of families. They knew each other very well. So I wouldn't say, though, I mean, I think it's an interesting thing because I come at it from a field of conflict management. So we have this theory in conflict management that plays out sometimes that, if we just understood one another, if we kind of had that, then we would all get along. Actually, in this part of the country, they understood each other very well, and they did not necessarily always get along, but they at least integrated, which maybe that's a testament that is very much. Elsewhere outside of Turkey, I mean, I think Berlin was really beautiful to see. If you are of a certain ilk of person who maybe is very active in seeking to be part of civil society or kind of political change, the fact that there were demonstrations and these kind of things was a great opportunity for people like that. But yeah, in general, I would say that the people that did a better job integrating were usually on the younger side, who learned the language, and then usually were of some type of profession that kind of could be brought into another context quite easily.
Nice. So, Rafif or Basma, who wants to get into the how do you get rid of Assad question?
You want to go for it, Basma?
No, all yours.
You sure? Your question, thank you for that question. Any chance this horrendous regime will come to an end? Yes, because everything has to come to an end at some point. I still believe that nonviolent resistance, civil resistance, is effective. I believe that as long as there are Syrians who take to the streets peacefully despite the risks, this will be effective. I think we will see more internal conflict among regime members in that inner circle, especially as the economy continues to take this nosedive. I think a lot of the collaboration with civil society and political organizations outside has been helpful to those inside because one, they're getting a voice, two, they're getting training, three, they have matured politically because they have been through so much. And I think it is just a matter of time, but I can no longer predict amounts of time.
Okay, that's a very measured response. Yeah, quite appropriate.
5 years, 5 years.
5 years. Catherine?
Yes. Thank you. I'm Catherine Riley, and I'm a long-term board member of ICWA. I'm proud to be. So I was hoping you could reflect on Syrians' sense of home and getting deeper into the identity question. And is it even relevant to use a narrow sort of, they're either in Syria or they're displaced and they're in Berlin? Or are people identifying with perhaps multiple homes and thinking of themselves as perhaps having other identities that would transcend simply where they are or their Syrian identity? For example, you mentioned the global civil society, LGBTQ community, and Syrians having access to it in Berlin. Is that another place, yes, I would say belonging, a sense of belonging. So if you could reflect on that. I know it's a big question.
Okay. Would like to take a step?
Yeah, I mean, I'll just give a brief example. It's 13 years on, but there's a specific time of year. I think it technically just ended, but it's kind of the fall season where Syrians start to prepare by pickling, curing these different vegetables and fruits. When kind of produce is at its cheapest before kind of the literal and figurative winter comes. So a month ago I was in Istanbul and went around. There's a very unique food that's not just to Syria, but Syrians are very, I think are maybe the most proud of it, this makdous, which is this cured eggplant. And yeah, it was really beautiful to see a Syrian woman, teaching her daughter who was born outside of Syria, de facto stateless, but very much teaching her this tradition that very much connects to their land. They spoke about the olive oil from their farm, and kind of passing on these traditions. And that is just kind of one of the ways that you see kind of Syrian culture kind of persisting, or maybe even a more positive term than persisting, like kind of being galvanized even in exile 13 years on.
Yeah, I think it depends on who you ask, right? So I think this is, again, where the generational issue might come into play. So Joshua mentioned in his opening remarks how, some that have retired, were retired in retirees and had to flee Syria. Their ability to integrate into their new communities or new environment is probably a bit harder than someone who's born and raised there, right? So I think the sense of home really changes in meaning depending on the age of the individual, but also on their occupation. Is it transferable skills that you can take from one area to the next? And you can, are you a restaurant owner, and now you're seeing so many restaurant owners both in the DMV area, you're seeing them in Berlin and other areas around Europe, in Turkey, etc. So I think there's so many factors at play that can determine how comfortable you feel in your new environment, and if you're comfortable enough to call it a home, right? I think in the US, Syrians that newly moved to the US are learning what it means to be hyphenated Americans. And that's something that you see other communities, you can learn from other communities, that interaction with others, learning from different experiences is something that's really key. But the other thing I wanted to quickly highlight is it depends on where the Syrian was right before they managed to seek citizenship or like sustainable residency somewhere. So if you talk to Syrians in refugee camps, they probably have a very different sense of belonging at home, where they're struggling to make ends meet, where they're under threat of eviction, where they can't sustain their families. 90% of the people that we interviewed said they're facing immense challenges in just being able to provide for their family, access enough income to be able to pay and access basic services. So I think their definition of home and what it means to belong is very different than someone who has been resettled to the US and, you know, is on the pathway to becoming an American citizen.
Okay. Please.
Thanks. Hi, Whit Mason. I'm a former ICWA fellow in Istanbul and from London also. And I wanted to ask a relatively sharp policy question about the policy of not dealing with Assad all these years, the Western policy, that is. And I wonder what Syrians' views of that policy are. On the one hand, of course, he's widely and very understandably hated, and on the other hand, this policy hasn't brought a great deal of progress, and as everybody has noted, the only way out of this is some sort of political solution. Thanks.
Okay. Rafif, you wanna? Something tells me you wanna tee off on that.
I will try. I think for many, many Syrians, the policy of not dealing with Assad has contributed directly and materially to the current situation. I believe a lot of Syrians are angry. They have felt let down. There's the famous Obama red line. There are all kinds of pointers to a situation where they were encouraged to continue an uprising and then they were abandoned. So I think this has not helped. And I'm going to piggyback on the question of identity, because for those who have become hyphenated Syrians, Syrian German, Syrian French, Syrian Turkish, it's okay to have multiple identities in that sense. And they are becoming more vocal about the policies of not dealing with Assad. So I think there is some increasing outcry to say, address this problem at its root, deal with it. And for example, the outcry about the invitation to have Assad join the COP28 meetings, the petitions are fast and furious, and there is huge public outcry over that. So I hope that answers your question, at least in part. Thanks.
I guess, unfortunately, President Assad is on his way to Riyadh today, so it's his being welcomed back to the Arab fold has proven to not have yielded anything of substance, as I think we all of us who are observers can agree. But unfortunately, that doesn't mean that policymakers don't want to try it. I think, though, that the problem is that historically engaging with Assad yields very few benefits and at tremendous costs. The regime is unreformable, it seems, and incredibly rigid policy-wise. So changing its behavior is hard. I will say that, just a word about ICWA. ICWA fellowships are designed to take mid-career professionals to allow them to immerse them in these countries, but also to take their future in a different direction. And I'm not exactly sure what Joshua wants to do next, but I wanted to go into policy, and sometimes you get what you wish for, and so eventually, then years later, whatever, how many years later it was, 15 years, 12 years later, I find myself in the White House with the keys to the kingdom, so to speak, and what I learned, I think, out of that experience is that all the things that we think are going to work oftentimes don't in the way that we want them to. And I think the one thing I learned, though, as an American policymaker in particular, and I learned this on my first day on the job, I got a chance to meet everybody in the entire US system who dealt with Syria, and I said to them, if you were in my shoes and you were trying to achieve our goals, that was just getting Assad into a settlement under 2254, I said, how would you best do that? Like, what would you recommend to me as the Syria director? And I still remember some young guy says, how do you feel about using military force? And I said, I don't know, to be honest. And what I learned and what they said, I think, was very interesting. And that is, oftentimes here, it's either we engage or we bomb. This is unfortunately the way things have evolved. even when we do bomb, which we have on a number of occasions in Syria, and there was just a couple of US strikes over the last few days in eastern Syria against Iranian militia that are attacking our positions there. Military force is the most effective way to change anyone's behavior. You either physically destroy them or you deter them from doing anything else. But military force has a shelf life. It's like, and I think we've seen this in the use of chemical weapons. After President Trump's strikes on Syria, chemical weapons use went down for about a year and then unfortunately continued again. And so that's the real problem I think that we're in. It's all about the policy on Syria is not regime change a la Iraq. It's about changing Assad's behavior and getting him out of there as part of the political process. And that's the long-term struggle that we all have in front of us, that I don't have any easy answers for. Okay, one more question, I think. I see somebody way there in the back. Yes, you've been very patient. Thank you.
Glad I could take the microphone. I feel so lucky. Among so many people, I'm going to be probably the last one. So originally from Turkey and peace and conflict resolution scholar at American University, I actually brought my students here today. So, and I wanted to thank you, first of all of the research that you're doing in the speeches. And as you know, like Turkey is still in pain of finding its own identity for after how many years, like almost we celebrated the 100 years of Turkey a few days ago, but it's still developing its own identity because it's based on the major fault lines, ethnic religious fault lines, and trying to find like who we are, like how are we going to deal with all these different identities and how are we going to deal with all these issues. But refugee issue is obviously one of the most traumatic in a way process for majority of Turkish people. You will understand because I see that you're shaking your head. It's a trauma because we already had some other traumas and military coups, various tragic incidences, political incidences to fight and find identity in Turkey, and it's still in limbo. While Turkish identity is in limbo, and one of these actually participants asked a question about identity, I wanted to ask a very psychological question in a way, because it seems like repatriation is not possible at this moment. And the refugees are also in limbo. So the reality is that two communities need to get along with each other and find a way to, continue their life in Turkey. So from a socio-psychological perspective, what do these refugees are feeling about their own trauma, first of all, and how do they deal with that, which is very difficult. But on the other hand, as you know, Turkey in recent elections, for instance, one of the most ultra-nationalist political party said like, we're going to arrange buses to go to Syria after we win the elections. Like they were going to force people, refugees, to get into those buses, and those buses were going to go to Syria, which was a very radical, obviously, solution. So he obviously stayed below the election threshold. But the question, this is a reality that nationalism is the major fault line in Turkey. Either religious nationalism or secular nationalism. So for both sides, refugees are enemies in a way. They have enemy images about majority of the people have enemy images about refugees, whether Syrian or Afghan or other. So this is also the trauma of majority of Turkish people. So what do you think about the refugees as trauma, and how do you think that reconciliation may happen in upcoming decades? Is it possible?
Okay, I look, as you know, Turkey is the largest host country of refugees, so Turkey definitely has a lot of credit due for taking them in, and I think despite a lot of other countries kind of, Turkey was Turkey was the model of what now a lot of Western governments are doing, which is making deals to pay people to kind of keep refugees at bay. So I do think that Turkey has done a lot of good in terms of that. They've done a lot of other things as well that have not been so good, and I do think that Turkey is very much traumatized, as you said, played out in the recent elections. But the recent elections got pretty ugly, and kind of the side that maybe went more nativist toward the end didn't win. And now you have these policies that has kind of made both people inside the country and outside the country who kind of were looking to maybe interested in opposition groups. It really kind of hollowed it out. So I do think that there needs to be greater efforts at integration. I mentioned a few of them, of kind of removing this lack of temporariness, which I think actually the current government is in a stronger position to be able to do, just because it was their original policy to let people in. But at this time, it doesn't seem politically viable. It seems at this time it's more of their interest to kind of continue to maybe play the game of maybe or maybe not talking to the Syrian government, maybe or maybe not sending Syrians back en masse. And this is just unfortunately going to play out. So I do think it's quite ugly. In terms of integration, I think for Turkish people, you know better than I mean, I think the language is the key identity marker of the modern nation of Turkey that celebrated its 100-year anniversary. So I do think that efforts of allowing Syrians to be able to move more freely, to engage more in the economy and society, and through that also learning Turkish are ways to help address some of the trauma that is unfortunately still going on.
Do you want to sign off?
I will. Well, first of all, I'd like to
That was an absolutely terrific conversation. Thank you all so much. It was terrific also to have you all here, and I am especially thankful again to the Elliott School, which provided this terrific space, as well as the Delta Phi Epsilon fraternity, with whom it is just a pleasure to work organizing this talk, and a privilege. So thank you all. You can read Joshua's dispatches, all of them, on our website, www.iqua.org. And thanks again, and have a terrific rest of your day.
Thank you so much.